If you have questions, again, welcome everyone. You hear that this session is recorded. We're with a small group. If you have questions later on, you can actually ask them in the chat, and I will, at the end of my presentation, give some opportunity to ask the questions in person. I will also first introduce myself. My name is Rob Bauer. I'm a professor of finance at Maastricht University in the Netherlands. We are part of a consortium, a research consortium, that is led by the 2-degree investment initiative, but the consortium itself is called Level EEI. And I'm going to present you a way to look at eliciting sustainability preferences, and especially the replication kit we made that is relevant for asset managers and asset owners in this space. So this is a combination of work of a lot of colleagues of mine at Maastricht University, and some of which also went to other universities. But also together with 2-degree investments, we made this replication kit. Okay, so with that, let me just start and go into the presentation. So the context we're in is that all of us are investing in one way or another, either as an asset manager directly into corporations or private equity or whatever. But of course, these asset managers do this for a reason, because our clients, and these clients could be institutional clients, but it could also be retail clients. And in the case of an institutional client, the pension fund, there is actually a real ultimate owner of that money, which is actually you and me. We're all a member of some pension provision. And then the question is, if all these investment activities are happening, how are our views, preferences, beliefs integrated into the decision making? And in the past, of course, also civil society was active in that field, trying to influence corporations directly. And right now, civil society is also connecting directly with those asset managers, asset owners, and even us, our ultimate owners. And some of us are even active in the civil society space. So the question is then, how do you measure all those preferences for those clients and ultimate beneficiaries of the money? That was sort of the start of the research project. Before we go there, just very briefly, it's important to sort of set the scene. What exactly do I mean with sustainable investing or responsible investing, for which you need those preferences? I think there are 4 ways. One of them is obviously divestment, very much in the news. Some people call it exclusion. The second is sort of integration of this sustainability information into the decision process, where you want to make better returns because you have better information, also called inclusion. The third, stewardship, engagement, or maybe a whole bunch of active ownership strategies, voting, private engagement, etc., is another one. And the fourth is impact investing, where the goal is to create impact, less so the goal is to create financial returns, although some people say that you can combine that, which from a finance professor point of view is highly debatable, but not the topic of today. So in all those strategies, sometimes, at least in my observations, asset managers and owners integrate the sustainability information into the process. And that could be done on a financial motivation. So let's give an example. The UK pension fund USS had a financial motivation to divest from tobacco, which is quite interesting. And, because they thought tobacco firms, when they divested from it 2 years ago, will have a really grim future given the whole development in that sector. On the other hand, other pension funds actually, and also asset managers, divested from tobacco for non-financial motives. Tobacco from an ethical point of view is a really bad product. You cannot change it. You can engage for years, but it will not work. So you see that there's already a different reason why different motivations why they make these decisions. And in the context of a pension fund, that is really extraordinarily important, because let's take my example. I'm a university professor. I have to be in the ABP pension fund in the Netherlands, this big Dutch pension funds that you might know. I cannot leave it. I have to be in it. I have to spend 21 or 23% of my salary, a large part of which is paid by the employer, but also a large part by me, to the fund, and I cannot leave the fund. So I think there is a responsibility for those pension funds, not just ABP, but pension funds in general, to at least know what their participants think of the topic and go into a debate or interaction with the participants. So, but how do you then do that? So I've seen also in the MiFID space, I'm going to show you a bit more information in a minute, that also asset managers have to do this. If you get a retail client that wants you to manage the money for them, you have to ask them now sustainability preferences. And I let a student do some mystery shopping, and the students came back with the way that the average asset manager does this sustainability elicitation. And I think it's almost a euphemism to say that they are rather poorly constructed. So the last thing they do is measure the real preferences. So there will be a lot of measurement errors over there. And from a regulatory point of view, so for instance, the Autoriteit Financiële Markten in the Dutch context, but also many others in the European context, surveys can also be misused to steer people into a direction potentially that better than serves the asset manager than the clients. So yeah, that's another reason to really look carefully in how you can measure those preferences then. And also get hold of all those biases that may be in there, like the social desirable answer bias that probably all of you know. I'm also interested in the interaction between preferences and beliefs. So we're going to talk about both of them in this roughly 3/4 of an hour presentation and 15-minute discussion, or longer if we need it. And then again, the whole why do we do this, especially in the context of a pension fund? There is an intergenerational construct. You know, young people pay for the older people, and it also holds for sustainability. And the young generation I see every day at work, my students, I also got a few at home, my children, and they have some hugely different views than the older generation on the topic. And I think we should take that into account when we make financial products in any way, but also especially in those where there is this intergenerational solidarity going on. So the connection between civil society and ultimate owner is really important. I'll just give you an example of the Netherlands. The Dutch people will know in The Hague, every day and since the beginning of September, people were protesting from Extinction Rebellion on fossil subsidies being given. Those same people will be the future clients of asset managers, but also the future pension participants. So they have views on this that might be different from the generation that I'm from. And by the way, this is my son being active there. In a free world, in a mutual fund context, you have a choice. If you don't like it, you go. So this is a really interesting exogenous shock, namely Morningstar in 2016 in the third month suddenly came up with the so-called Morningstar globes. When this shock happened, you see that the flows are changing. On the left-hand side, before this globe was introduced to the market, funds could not easily signal that they are sustainable. It was not, let's say, there was no stamp or no proof about that. So low sustainability fund flows, the red lines, were quite equal to those of high sustainability fund flows. Whereas if you look at the period after, suddenly there was way much more flow into sustainable funds than into non-sustainable funds. So you see that sizable fund flows away from investors that visibly ignore and towards investors that visibly address sustainability. And also nicely written down in the paper by Samuel Hartzmark and others in the Journal of Finance. So in this case, people have choice. In a pension fund context, in a defined contribution space where people make their own decisions more than in a defined benefit case, that may be sort of similar. So I'm going to go show you some examples. You can also see them in the replication kit that are both from the defined benefit space, from defined contribution space where people have a bit more choice, but also in a mutual fund case, we're going to give you an example where they have the choice. So what are then the motives to invest sustainably? An article by Arno Riedel and my colleague Paul Smeets, who's now working in Amsterdam, but also was part of this project. Before we actually started the project, he already investigated this under clients of a mutual fund organization, in this case, Robeco. So upfront, the idea was people might have the motivation to get better returns. So the arbitrageur depicted by Michael Douglas over here. The other motivation might be to signal to maybe even yourself, but also to others that you are really into this topic. So if we are at a party, you can tell people, I'm into a sustainable, responsible investment fund. The third motivation could be you really want to do good. You get a warm glow out of giving. And so it's not so much about you and your reputation and signaling, but more about helping others. So these are three different motivations. And in a survey they constructed with real clients in a real context and also real consequences, they found that social preferences, so let's say Santa's view and signaling, Obama's representation, play a key role and financial incentives a lesser role. So you already see some first indications here in this research before we started with our project that social preferences play a really important role. But now the question is, what does the law say about that? So in the European context, we got MiFID and there are requirements for asset managers. I'm not going to go through the whole list here, but in the main amendment introduced to MiFID II, and they are relevant since the 1st of August last year, firms will need to collect information from clients on their preferences and also make them products or solutions that are in line with those preferences, which means, and if they're not, they are breaching their duty of care or loyalty. So it's quite important for asset managers to know that. There is not such a regulation in the context of pension funds yet, but and the European Commission came up with a document in July in which they state that the Commission will ask EIOPA to assess the potential need to broaden the concept of the long-term best interest of members and beneficiaries and the obligation to consider sustainability impacts. And that would ensure that the framework also better reflects members' and beneficiaries' sustainability preferences. So it's coming there as well. Of course, in Europe, then a whole lobby starts on whether you should do that or not. And there are some conflicting interests in whether you should do that or not. But I'm pretty sure that at some point in the next few years, also pension funds will do that. And actually in the Dutch case, it is already more or less common practice that you do that. Because the biggest funds signed a covenant in which they pledge to integrate members' preferences into the analysis. Okay, so I'll give you two examples, one from the Netherlands, where we conducted a project with the retail pension fund, the Pensioenfonds Detailhandel, relatively big fund, 35 billion assets under management. We also did that's a DB plan. So like me, you get in and you cannot get out. In the United Kingdom, we also conducted a project jointly with the University Superannuation Scheme, which is the largest UK fund. So I think it's like £100 billion or something. It has a defined benefit part, but we investigated the supplementary DC, defined contribution part. And both funds are really interested in eliciting their beneficiaries' preferences regarding sustainable investments. In the guide, you get way more information, and you can download the guide in the link you see there. By the way, also this will be recorded, so you will also see over there where you can download this. So let me go to the first example, Pensioenfonds Detailhandel. This is a screenshot from the replication kit. So we did a study there in 2018, a study in 2020, and then also in 2022, we did some additional work. The first study was essentially a binding referendum with a consequential vote. And this is really important. You ask a question and there's a consequence to the answer you give as a group. And we know from the survey literature that you then will be more likely to get to elicit the real preferences of people because there's a consequence. And the second study, we repeated this study because we wanted to know whether these preferences that people signaled are constant. So was there a change? And especially because it was during COVID that we did the second study in 2020, June, a few months after COVID burst out. And we wanted to know whether COVID had an impact on those preferences and on the decision to be more sustainable in the investment analysis. And then the third study was a risk preference study. I will not have time to talk about that, but it is a connection. So in MiFID, you also have to ask risk preferences in the context of retail clients. But how are these risk preferences connected to sustainability preferences is a really tough question. And some people want more sustainability and they want low risk. How do you connect the two? So we also did a study on that. It's in our replication kit mentioned, but I'm not going to talk about that today because we just don't have the time for that. So in the context of the detailhandel, we gave them a real choice, a binding referendum. And the question that was asked was a very simple question. Do you want to let the fund be more active or extend the engagement strategy, the private engagement strategy that they were doing from 3 to 4 SDG topics, which means way more engagements, at least 25% more, but also more intense engagement, so more than 25% more engagements, which participants were explained what engagement is. It's really important. In the pilot, it was shown that nobody really got it if you don't explain this very well. So in the survey we had to explain what exactly is engaging with companies, some examples of that, and also what more intense engagements mean. And so more intense engagement mean that you not just send an email and that's it, but you also visit the company, you visit them maybe another time, you press on them in different ways. So it's a collection of activities that's more intense engagement relative to just one little email that you want them to change, which is of course way less effective. So participants of the fund in this binding referendum could then vote yes, no, or no opinion to the simple referendum question. And what is the really interesting part is that the board of that fund committed to the majority outcome, if there would be one, because you don't know that upfront, obviously. So it's a very simple choice, yes, no, or I don't know. And the rule is if there are more than 50% say yes to it, or more than 50% say no to it, could also be the case, then the board would implement the choice. So now the question is how many did do this? We also did a particular additional analysis. We created 2 groups. We treated one group by saying that the board would execute the choice, whereas in the other group, we just said, what do you want? So not signaling that the board would execute the choice, because we wanted to know whether this real choice versus a hypothetical choice would have an impact on the result, which is a very interesting question from also an academic perspective. So you see here the results. 70% of the people actually said yes, roughly, to the question, and it was irrespective of whether the question had this binding commitment from the board or not. So the hypothetical case had exactly the same result than the real case, whereas we expected that the red bar over here would be way lower. You see that there is a group of 10% that says no to this, and that there is also a group of 20 to 25%, which probably also signals that not everyone exactly understands what's going on, says, I don't know. So 70 to 10%, and the board immediately within a week after executed the vote. So after that, more engagements, more intensive engagements, more money spent on engagements, which we also explained before they had to answer the question in the referendum. So the fund invested in that. So because they decided this in 2018 and 2020, they did another survey to make sure that that actually participants still like it in the midst of COVID, as I said. And they also did something more. So what they did afterwards is not just extend the engagement, but they also created, together with FTSE Russell, an index in which they have these 4 SDGs and in which they overweigh and underweigh based on those 4 SDGs versus a big index of FTSE. So they created a new product based on this. And the fund was really interested in the fact whether the participants of the pension fund are really interested in this topic, yes or no. So you have to then explain them quite a bit. So we give you an example here on how we explained engagement in that particular study. So we say in practice, this means that Pensioenfonds Detailhandel will talk to more companies, speak more intensively about sustainability, and vote more often at shareholder meetings about sustainability. And we also show them the evidence after 2018. So we showed this in 2020 in the second survey that it actually happened, and how they do it, that they also cooperate with others, etc. Same thing for explaining the screening. So after a few pilots, this was the best way to explain people what screening means. So we told them on the left-hand side, when you exactly invest in the index, companies A to E have certain positions in that index. And on the right-hand side, we overweigh E, D, and C, and we finance that by underweighing A and B, all based on these SDGs, these 4 SDGs that are important for the fund. And that gives you a different position. And that's what we're asking you, do you like that, yes or no, this screening? What we found out is that people way better understood this screening, overweighing versus an index, than exactly what engagement is. You can also see that in our results. And these results are more elaborate than the previous one I showed you, because here you have beliefs and preferences. On the left-hand side, you see the beliefs of the pension participants. You see that there is a distribution to the question. Through sustainable investing, retirement benefits of the fund, in my view, will be much lower, lower, equal, higher, or much higher. So you see a bit of a roughly, on average, equal outcome. So they have a view that on average it's equal, but there's a huge dispersion. Some people, 7% of the participants that participated in the survey, actually said that it is much lower, and 23% said that it is lower. So whereas there's also a group that is really very positive about it. And again, there's a group, and probably I would answer that I don't know whether it will be higher or lower. But people have views, and these views are connected to the preferences they have, which of course also makes sense, but also the question is in which direction, and that is for more research. You see here that the group that has much lower beliefs on where the returns are going, only 40% says, yes, we should do the screening, and only even less than 30% say that we should absolutely not do the engagement. You see how the more positive you get, the more likely you're going to say yes to the questions of engagement and screening. And here on that side, it's interesting that even if you have lower returns, that the majority of 60% for engagement and more than 80% of screening still says, let's do it, even if it has lower returns. But the fund has a group of 7% that really doesn't like this to happen. So it's quite a challenge for funds what to decide with this dispersion. And actually, this is also used as a motivation for many funds to not do anything, because they say, how can we answer all of this? That's a tough one. So that was the Dutch case where defined benefit, people cannot get out, board commits to the result. Then the management of USS approached us because they saw the study we did. They said, can you do something similar in the UK? I said, of course we can. We're very interested to broaden this to another country. But can you please then also make sure that you commit to the outcomes, just like it happened in the case of detailhandel. But that board didn't want to do that. So we had to come up with a solution for that. So they felt, I think they even quoted, I probably not exactly quoted, but one of the board members told me, it's not about what members need, what we have to do. Sorry, what they want, what we have to do, but exactly what members need, what we have to do. But still, it's very important to know what they actually want, because we can use it in communication, and it might also overlap with what they need. So that's good to know then. But then the question is, how do you prevent socially desirable answers? So the thing we did is we had sort of a 3 or 4 pronged approach. We let people ask little stories, which was not very successful because most of the people did not write a story, or they just wrote a few very short sentences with a lot of unclear content. Then the second thing we did is we asked very abstract questions on their preferences. So these are stated preferences in an abstract term. For instance, if people are in need, how willing are you to help them? Is sort of valid constructs from the survey literature. So out of altruism and similarly. The second type of stated preferences are more practical preferences that I will show you an example of in a minute. And the fourth thing we did is an investment game, which are, let's say, revealed preferences that we identify in a game. So we created a game. And all of those different measurements give us also the opportunity to compare within an individual whether the results are consistent. Still, it's in my view, better to have a real consequences. So to really check this in the field when people make actual decisions with consequences. But we couldn't do that at the moment that we did this research. So what about these preferences? I'm going to focus on the more practical stated preferences here. So they're measured directly by asking members in the survey. And the pro, it's simple and easy to implement. People also understand it. But of course, survey questions are hypothetical again, and people often claim to behave in a certain manner, but do not back their talk by action. So we suffer from that potentially in this question. Although we saw in the tie handle that it didn't have a consequence in the results, as you may remember. So the results are on the question: how much should your pension fund invest in a sustainable way, even if this potentially lowers the pension you get in retirement? And you will see that the average USS member answered 5.67 on a scale of 7, so to the full extent. And that is quite a high number. And what's very much in line with the abstract questions we ask, which were also roughly 5.7 out of 7 on these more abstract abstract question scales. So we conclude that USS members, at least in this context, have very strong stated preferences. But we also wanted to go a step further and created a game, a very simple game, and with an important point in it: financial incentives. So out of this game, we could reveal the preferences would be revealed, and in the game, people could also make some real money. So if you won in the game, you could get a return out of the fund that you selected, and that already has been paid out in the past few years when we did the game. So what was the game like? I'm going to tell you in a minute, but the pros of such a game is that you might get a better reflection of real preferences because they have skin in the game. There is a financial reward to being in the game. But of course, it may be more difficult and expensive to elicit. So more difficult, do people really understand the game? And secondly, is the financial incentive big enough? And thirdly, if you have financial incentives and a lot of people participate in the game, it's quite expensive for people for the people who organize the game, in this case, the pension fund. So how did the game like? You already see it. It looks very complicated, but essentially it's quite simple. So people who participated were endowed with a real £1,000. Of course, the £1,000 real, I mean that they would get the money. They have to decide whether they choose an allocation between a sustainable fund and a conventional fund, where we also created a trade-off. You can see that the sustainable fund that they could invest £1,000 in has 1.5% fees, whereas the conventional fund they could choose to allocate the money to has only 0.5% fees. So there's a trade-off, which also, again, from a finance professor point of view, makes a lot of sense. You can't have it all: great returns, low risk, and sustainability. It has to come from some point. Although a lot of people say, I was at a Morningstar conference last Wednesday, well, we can do it all, and that does not make sense, especially not in equilibrium. So we wanted to give a real context here where there is a choice. And in this particular case, we also did something extra. So you see this wiggle room condition. Imagine you go to the supermarket and the Sisters of Mercy are trying to get you to donate to the Sisters of Mercy at the entrance. But there's also another entrance at the back, at the other side of the supermarket. It would take you a 300-meter walk to do that. So you have to do some effort to get to the other entrance where the Sisters of Mercy are not collecting, or for you to donate. And that way you could sort of wiggle out of the decision. So you could wiggle out of the signaling that you signal essentially to the Sisters of Mercy. You want to say no to it because you don't want to give them money. One way to get around of that is to go to the other entrance, but it comes with some effort. So what we here did is create a wiggle room condition to invest in a certain default option, which is either the conventional one, 0.7% fee. So you see the costs here are higher than if you go to the real conventional fund, but then you don't signal your choice. Or you can wiggle out by going into the sustainable fund for 1.7%, which doesn't make a lot of sense in this particular case, but we should give that. So what we found is that not a lot of people use the wiggle room in the game. So that was an academic experiment that to some extent didn't work. But what the game did is people went exactly to this choice. And what we found is that, so that's the trade-off, that's 70% of the money was invested in the more expensive, so ex-ante lower return, you would say, fund with sustainable preferences. So these revealed preferences for sustainable investing are again strong. And also at this, let's say 70%, roughly 70% of 1,000, you see that a lot of people take the whole money into the fund, 45%, but it's also scattered around all the other numbers. And you see that 10% does nothing in the fund. So there is some variation between participants over here, but the average of people actually invest the largest part in that fund. And then there are financial incentives. So if you selected whatever fund you selected, we had real funds over there that you would get a return from. So if you had 1,000 funds and in the next year the fund would have a 20% return, then you would get a £200 out of that. Of course, not everyone got that. We had a lottery in which you had a particular probability of receiving that money, which makes it tractable for both academics and also the people that cooperate with us, like in this case, USS, to do this. Okay, so I refrain from that slide. What is interesting is however, who actually holds the sustainable fund. So what we find is that women invest more in the sustainable fund in that game, and that the people who earn more money invest less in sustainable funds. So the income, the salary of university professors or admin people who are in the fund, if that is higher, you invest less in a sustainable fund, which is actually in line with what we found in other studies in the past. We, on the other hand, have to say that in principle, demographics, it's cool that there is a difference, but the R squared of all those differences is not that big. So it's not that demographics determine the result, it's especially the strong sustainability preferences that determine the result. So what we found here, that with abstract questions, with practical stated preference questions, and with this game, they're all looking into the same direction, which gives at least USS some strong view, I would say a relatively strong view, that the people, that the participants want sustainability integrated into their fund. And interestingly, I think the recent court cases of a few professors really signal that even more, because they want certain strategies to happen there as well. I think on the divestment of oil. Anyway, what is really interesting is, of course, also, do people get this? And do people understand what they're doing over here? Which is always something that you have to critically look at. And why is this a critical situation? So we ask members, do you own this ethical fund that USS has? So USS really has a DC number of funds. Some of them are normal conventional funds, but one fund is so-called ethical fund. And then when we ask people, 64% of the people state, yes, we own part of that fund at USS. Whereas in reality, only 11% hold the ethical fund. So that is an interesting one. You know, you think that you own it, but you don't own it. So why is that? Could have several explanations that we don't have time for, but it shows that it is very crucial to explore real behavior. So if we would be able to do a field experiment in which we show people choices, not a game, but a real choice to invest in either the ethical or the other fund, we can really see what people decide in the field. Then we can draw stronger conclusions than in this case. So there's absolutely more work ahead for us to find organizations who want to cooperate with us in the field when people make real decisions. Some other funny things, you know, these are university professors and admin personnel from the university context or sector. We also ask them, what should the fund divest? So for instance, they don't want to divest from aviation because, you know, professors especially, they fly to a lot of conferences across the globe. They also want to keep on investing in nuclear facilities to probably solve the energy transition that way. And they also want to keep on drinking. I don't know whether this is a professor issue or a UK issue or a general human issue, but they don't want to divest from alcohol as well. Okay, so this was sort of a side project, and the conclusion, I think, is clear. USS members have strong preferences. There's a huge difference between choices in the investment game and the actual allocation to their portfolio. So we have to be careful with the interpretation of this. I was actually approached by Divest US the moment we published the article that they want to use our study in a blog. So civil society picks this up. This is a group of people who are working at USS that want to change USS way of investing. So this is a dynamic space. We're not there yet. It's not that this is in an equilibrium, how USS is investing and what their participants want. So there's a lot of attention to the topic, and this will somehow continue. And so there will also be a lot of opportunities for researchers to study this. Okay, so you can read a lot about this. I put it in here for those who are going to look at the video later on in those two papers that I talked about so far, and that are also output of our European project. Just an intermezzo. This is what Philips Pension Fund is. So Philips went to actually asked Paul and me from the team, can you help us? We have this survey. We got it from a survey company, and we don't like the survey because it is way too much focus on questions that people don't understand or that lead to social desirability bias. Can you help us? But in the end, they, after the discussion we had, they themselves came up with this particular graph, and I find this a really nice one. So on the left-hand side, so Mantje 1, 2, 3, and 4 means basket 1, 2, 3, and 4. It's in the context of equities. And they said, do you want to invest in this first basket, which has all the stocks, including the bad ones, which are the red ones in here? Do you want to invest in the second one, which has a tilt towards the better ones, but there's also a lot of white ones, which are sort of not particularly good, not particularly bad on the context of sustainability? Do you want to invest in the third, where there's way more allocation to the green companies and even more of the greener companies, dark green companies? Or do you really want to, you could say this is almost an impact investment mandate in just the green ones and also big positions, less diversification for that reason? And just to be clear, when they were shown the picture, this box wasn't there. They could choose between those four. We had four on purpose, because if you have five, people tend to go to the middle. We also know that. And in the end, they chose the third basket, which is interesting because 70% of the people said we want to have again, the 70%, it almost seems to be like a magical figure, said we want to have basket 3, and only a few percent went in either 2 or 4, and very few in 1. So that is quite interesting, a different way of doing it, visualizing it. And I think also when I look at my own research and our group's research, the visualization is really important. So there is upside potential in helping people understand what we're actually doing here with visuals. And so that's probably something that we're going to work on in the future. Just as a remark, because I don't have the time to talk about it, but also we have not actually already executed the survey in a different context. In this case, Be Frank, which is a Dutch pension arrangement provider to companies. So companies can go to Be Frank and ask for a pension arrangement for their employees. And these are typically defined contribution type of arrangements. And the company sets the default for that arrangement. And in the case of Be Frank, these defaults can vary between, let's say, a regular fund, a fund with a tilt towards sustainability, or a real sustainable default. You see that most of the defaults are in either the regular one or the light sustainability one. But we ask ourselves the question, does company management know what their employees want, or their beneficiaries in this case as well? So we're going to do a project in which the company management has to predict what their beneficiaries want. After that, we tell them what their beneficiaries want. And then after that, we ask them, do you want to change the defaults, yes or no? So that's a really cool study that we are setting up, and which is also relevant for a lot of other European countries in which these pension arrangements are being provided by asset management organizations. But I don't have results yet, so I cannot show you more than what we wrote in the replication kit. The last thing I'm going to tell you before I stop and give you the opportunity to ask questions is on the mutual fund context, and a very specific one. So Meesman Index Investing is a very small Dutch boutique that provides an umbrella of index funds to clients. And one of those funds is the High ESG Index Fund, sort of a fund in which you try to mimic the MSCI World, or even broader than that, but then limit the number of stocks considerably, but still have a lot of stocks in there, so that you have still this index element, like a broad diversification, but at the same time also a tilt towards the greener companies. And the The project we did over there is that we created a treated group again. We call that the ESG group. And the other group who's not treated is the non-ESG group. The treated group in the survey got information on the fund. So information on the ESG of the fund, the high ESG-ness of the fund. So it was explained what it is, what type of decisions were made by the fund, in detail, whereas the other one got all the information on the financials, like the ESG group got, but no information on the same fund on the ESG. So the left group is treated by that, and the right group is not. So we asked them first an unincentivized Likert scale question, and sorry for the Dutch in here, but I'm going to explain it to you. So we want to ask them a very simple question. I expect that the return of the sustainable fund compared to of this high ESG sustainable fund is higher or lower than the non-sustainable funds in general. So that was asked to both the ESG and the non-ESG group. The result is then that you see on top here all results to the question, but you see on average that there's a bit more tilt to the left, so a bit lower. And so if you look at the results over here, there's a little bit of a skew to this side, where people are expecting a bit lower return, and that there is no real difference between the treated group, the green one, and the non-ESG group. Small differences over here that are not really statistically significant. So in an unincentivized context, people's expectations about returns, their return beliefs, are a bit lower than the conventional counterfact of such a fund. Well, then we created a method that was proposed in the academic literature called the exchangeability method, where there's a basic setup that we select a high ESG fund, as I just told you, and we provide annual returns of a particular fund of 6 consecutive years, and then ask people of the treated and the non-treated group to come up with the 7- and 8-year returns of those funds as a prediction. And of course, again, the ESG group has the information of the fund that it is a high ESG rating, and the non-ESG group has only the financial information. So everything else is the same except for the ESG information. And then people could also, again, and that's important, win. So they have to predict the returns. We show them that these are real returns of real funds. We show them the real returns, and if they were right, they took part of a lottery to win something. So it looked like this. You showed them 6 years in a row the returns, and they had to predict the 7th year in this particular case. And later on also the 8th year, but I don't think I have time, given the time constraint I have to go into detail here. I want to show you the results mainly. So you see here on the left-hand side, this is the graph I'm going to talk about now, the 7th year return that people predict. And you see that the group that was treated with ESG information has a higher prediction than the group that has no ESG information. So this is a fundamentally different result than in the unincentivized Likert scale, where people say something unincentivized in an unincentivized way. And here they can win something. We might expect them to elicit true preferences. We don't know, but I'm going to show you that there's a big indication that it also probably is a better estimate than the unincentivized Likert scale. Because, so I'm not going to talk about the negative scenario and the positive scenario in year 8, because we give them then some information on a positive return or a negative return and see how they respond. But you see there is no difference over there. We also asked them something different. That is, namely, do you think the risk of the fund, so the belief on risk, lower or higher? And you see here again that most people expect lower risks connected to ESG funds, which is interesting as well. So on the one hand, and you see that on the right-hand side, really nicely graphed by my colleague Bin Dong. So you see here that people who have much higher return expectations, that's the belief toward ESG returns relative to non-ESG, they have lower risk expectations. So essentially, people think they can get great returns and low risk. Probably because all the marketing also tells them that. I don't know, but at least that's what they believe. And that's really important to know if you communicate with them, and also if you discuss with clients what makes sense, also from a financial point of view. So irrespective of marketing. So that's an interesting result coming out of this experiment as well. In the lab, we found something similar. So we also did something like this with students in the past, and at Maastricht University. Similar results, although there was a bit more response to the positive and the negative news that was coming. But I, again, refrain from that in the interest of time. So I'm 5 minutes over time, but we can stay a bit longer if you have the time for that, to discuss the discrete choice experiment, where we show people choices and attributes of funds. So you see the different attributes over here on sustainability, gray, light green, dark green, on fees, lower or higher, on types of strategies like screening, positive screening, negative screening, active engagement, or return risk composite. So how risky is the fund? So these are hypothetical funds that we show them. So as an example, you see here a choice. Which one of the three funds do you like? The light green one, the dark green one, or the gray one? And you see that they have certain attributes. They are more expensive than the other two, for instance, the light green. There is active engagement going on, and it has a particular return risk profile over here. We show them several times these choices, and they still have to make the choice every time which of the three funds they like. And out of that, we can, with a procedure, elicit their utility they get to each of those attributes. So what we find over there in general is that people in the index context of Meesman, which is interesting, it's a special breed of investors, they like ESG. They don't care as much whether it's light green or dark green. They also have a preference for negative screening above other types of screening. So that is also interesting to see. So in the end, even though they are index investors, they really like the topic of sustainability, but not necessarily in a lot of detail, which makes sense for index investors in my case. And I think, therefore, it's very interesting to do this also with really active retail investors, or maybe even online brokerage retail investors. Now, the question you might have is, you elicit these preferences, but why are they a better, let's say, proxy for what they actually would do in real life than the unincentivized Likert scale, where there's no financial incentives? So what we did is, in the survey, on several occasions, they could win some money. And at the end of the survey, every participant could choose when they would win the money, in which fund they would invest their proceeds. So that could either be a fund that is called Aandelen Wereldwijd Totaal, which is a fund that has less sustainability profile, and a fund called Aandelen Duurzame Toekomst, which essentially is this high ESG fund that we were talking about. And what you see in the results is that people who also score higher on these beliefs also spend way more money on the sustainable fund than on the fund that is less high-end sustainable. So that's quite interesting. So you see the same behavior over there, and they can win a prize over here as well. And I think this is a really nice additional confirmation that probably people have these high beliefs on ESG funds. It's a totally different question whether that makes sense. I mean, from a theoretical point of view, that cannot continue forever. There needs to be an equilibrium. If you have lower risk because of ESG risk, you might also have a lower return expectation for that reason, a requirement. Anyway, I'm going to round off with a conclusion. And the conclusion is, I think, if you as asset managers or asset owners communicate with your clients, it's not just your marketing that is important. You also have to talk to these people, and not just talk, but maybe also do some of the things that we've done in a very unbiased way to get real insights and maybe even unheard voices among your clientele, or maybe even beyond your clientele, potential clientele. If you do surveys there, it's really important to do that properly. There are lots of biases for which I did not have the time to talk about. But if you're interested in that, biases of surveys, focus groups, town halls, pitfalls for that, you may go to that article by my colleague Stancheva at Harvard Business School. She did a really nice overview of that, and you can find all of that in the replication kit. The financial incentives are really powerful, in my view. In other contexts, we've also shown that they are much more effective than a lot of marketing and communication efforts. So you may ask yourselves, maybe spend a bit more money on financial incentives and when you do surveys, experiments, or any other elicitation projects, then spend them on fancy leaflets, brochures that try to sell something. And I think you should really use the full tool set that is available, some of which I showed you, but there's way more to elicit those preferences properly. I think what we can also learn from what we've done in the replication kit is that real consequences help eliciting the real preferences of people next to the financial incentives. And I think it's very important, whatever survey or project you do, is that you make sure that you explain to people what you're doing, but also that you realize there are boundaries. Some things it's very difficult to explain, and especially on the financial side and the pension fund side, that is really tough. People just don't get it. And then you have to be careful with interpretation of results, and it also holds for our results. I think a really important point is also the safety of your survey. So if you do a survey, you have an interest. And so if MiFID tells you to survey your participants, you might have an interest in that and make your survey conditional on your interests. So that might lead to people not be really feel safe and not give their real preferences. So you might think about other ways independently surveying your participants, maybe way more effective to know what's going on, or your clients. Okay, with that, I conclude and open it up for a question. So you may indicate either with a I'm going to stop sharing, with a hand, whether you want to ask a question, or just write it in the chat if that is more comfortable for you. Who would like to start raising a hand? So it might be that I was either utterly clear or totally confusing you. It could also be that you don't have a question. Anyone? Comment? Thomas. Yes, so.
Hi, thanks, Rob. I just wanted to say, I don't know why my camera's not on, but it's not on. The chat is deactivated. Just so you know, I really enjoyed the presentation, really liked it. I'm definitely going to look at that paper from Stan Sheva, but thanks very much for the presentation.
Okay, thanks.
The chat is deactivated, but you have the Q&A possibility for everybody. Kevin has used it to thank Rob.
Any others? You can also start a conversation. I can also ask you a question. So Alan, I don't know whether you're still there. What do you think of it? Can we use this? And you're in the university context. Alan, you can talk now.
Hi, Rob. I'm on a bus, so I'm listening mode, but I will email you later. This is great. Really
okay, this will also be recorded, so we will also put it on the website of 2 Degree Investing and probably on LinkedIn and that. Yeah. And there's way more. So in the replication kit, you can also read the individual articles, references to surveys, and some of the ideas we have for the future. Yeah. Okay, but if there are no other questions, we are going to call it a day. I thank you for being present. It is a Friday morning. The weather is great, at least in the Netherlands, so I can understand why not everyone is there. And the fatigueness on webinars is also quite prevalent. But luckily, it's recorded, and there's also a document that can be disseminated. But you are here, and I really would like to thank you for being here. And if you have any further questions on the topic, feel free to contact me. And you can also see that my colleague Bin Dong, who is very much into the topic of the Meesman example that I gave, if you have some questions, please forward them to us, and we will respond. And with that, Anaïs, I think we can close the webinar.
Yes. Thank you, everybody. Have a lovely day. Bye.
Bye.